Lonely rancher rescued an Apache girl, sold for 2 horses by her uncle. The gunshot echoed across the desert valley like thunder, but it was not the sound of violence that would change everything. It was the sound of mercy. Thomas McKenna had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what hope felt like. The sun blazed mercilessly over his small ranch in the Arizona Territory, where dust devils danced across the barren landscape like ghosts of his past. His weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he watched the horizon, searching for something he could not name. The year was 1873, and the frontier was a place where men carved their destinies from stone and sand. Thomas had built his life here with nothing but determination and the sweat of his brow. His ranch sat in a valley surrounded by red mesas that glowed like fire at sunset, a harsh but beautiful land that demanded respect from all who dared to call it home. At 35, Thomas had the kind of face that spoke of hard years and harder choices. Deep lines etched around his gray eyes told stories of drought seasons and cattle losses, of neighbors who had packed up and left when the land proved too unforgiving. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, hung longer than was fashionable back east. But fashion meant nothing out here where survival was the only currency that mattered. The loneliness had become a constant companion, as familiar as the ache in his back from years of back-breaking work. He had come west after the war, carrying wounds that went deeper than the scar on his left shoulder from a Confederate bullet. The ranch had been his refuge, his chance to build something meaningful from the ashes of a country torn apart by brother fighting brother. His closest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the nearest town, Copper Ridge, was a 2-day ride through Apache territory. The isolation that had once been a blessing now felt like a curse. Thomas talked to his horses more than he talked to people, and sometimes he caught himself having entire conversations with the wind. The Apache had been quiet lately, too quiet. Thomas knew enough about the tribes to understand that silence often preceded storm. The government's broken promises and the encroachment of settlers had pushed the Apache to the breaking point. Raids had become more frequent, more desperate, and Thomas had fortified his ranch accordingly. His modest adobe house sat like a fortress in the valley, with thick walls and narrow windows that could serve as rifle ports if necessary. The barn and corral were positioned to provide clear sightlines in all directions. Thomas had learned to sleep with one ear open and his Winchester within arm's reach. But it was not fear that kept him awake at night. It was the crushing weight of solitude, the knowledge that he was building something that would die with him. He had no family left, no legacy to leave behind. The ranch would return to the desert, and it would be as if Thomas McKenna had never existed at all. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Thomas rose before dawn, as was his custom, and stepped onto his porch to watch the sun paint the mesas in shades of gold and crimson. The desert was never truly silent. Coyotes called to each other across the vastness, and the wind whispered secrets through the sagebrush. He was checking on his small herd of cattle when he first heard the voices. They carried on the morning air, speaking in a language he did not understand but recognized as Apache. Thomas moved carefully to a rocky outcropping that provided cover while giving him a view of the trail that wound through the valley. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of 6 Apache warriors on horseback had stopped near the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his land. They were not painted for war, but their presence here was troubling enough. Thomas recognized the leader, a man called Broken Arrow, whose reputation for cruelty was known throughout the territory. But it was not the warriors that held Thomas's attention. It was the girl. She could not have been more than 16, with long black hair that hung loose around her shoulders and skin the color of burnished copper. Her clothes were simple but well made, the traditional dress of Apache women, but her wrists were bound with rawhide cord. She sat straight-backed on an old mare, her chin raised in defiance despite her obvious fear. Thomas strained to hear their conversation, picking up fragments of Spanish mixed with Apache words. His understanding of both languages was limited, but he caught enough to piece together what was happening. The girl was being sold, traded like a piece of livestock to men whose intentions were clearly not honorable. The buyer was a man Thomas recognized from Copper Ridge, Jake Morrison, a slave trader who operated on the fringes of the law. Morrison had ridden out with 2 other men, all of them armed and looking like the kind of predators who thrived in lawless places. As Thomas watched, Morrison approached the girl's horse and reached up to grab her chin, forcing her to look at him. She jerked away, her eyes flashing with anger that reminded Thomas of a cornered wildcat. Morrison laughed, a sound that made Thomas's skin crawl. The negotiation continued for several minutes, with Broken Arrow demanding payment and Morrison inspecting his purchase like she was livestock. Finally, Morrison reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small pouch, payment that seemed insultingly small for a human life. But it was the horses that sealed the deal. 2 mares, nothing special but worth their weight in mobility and freedom to Apache warriors. The girl's uncle, for that was what Broken Arrow was to her, had sold his own blood for the price of 2 horses. Thomas felt something break inside his chest as he watched the transaction. The girl's stoic mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the terror underneath as Morrison's men moved to take possession of her. She looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route or a friendly face, but found neither. The moral weight of what he was witnessing crashed down on Thomas like a physical blow. Here was a young woman, barely more than a child, being sold into a fate that would likely be worse than death. Every instinct he had developed as a civilized man screamed at him to act, but his rational mind reminded him that he was one man against 6 armed killers. The smart thing to do would be to let them pass and pretend he had seen nothing. The safe thing would be to stay hidden and protect his own neck. But as Thomas looked at the girl's face, he saw something that made his decision for him. He saw hope dying in her eyes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This girl, this stranger whose name he did not even know, was about to disappear into a hell that would consume her piece by piece, and he was the only person in the world who could stop it. Thomas McKenna had spent years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of loss and disappointment. But in that moment, watching a young woman's spirit being crushed before his eyes, those walls crumbled like sand. He checked his rifle, said a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and stepped out from behind his cover. The sound of his boots on the rocky ground was like thunder in the desert silence. All eyes turned to him as he approached, his Winchester held at the ready, but not yet pointed at anyone. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Morning, gentlemen. Lovely day for a ride, isn't it?" Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Thomas's reputation as a marksman was well known in these parts. The slave trader's eyes narrowed as he tried to gauge the threat level. "McKenna, this is none of your business. Keep walking." Thomas's gaze shifted to the girl, who was staring at him with a mixture of hope and confusion. Up close, he could see that she was even younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 15. Her dark eyes held intelligence and strength, but also a desperate plea for help. "Actually, Morrison, I think it is my business. This is my land you're conducting your trade on." It was a lie, but a calculated one. The creek marked the boundary, and they were technically just outside his property. But in a place where boundaries were fluid and law enforcement was non-existent, possession was 9/10 of the truth. Broken Arrow spoke up in halting English, his voice filled with suspicion. "You want girl? You pay more than horse trader." Thomas felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He had enough money saved to buy the girl's freedom, but that would only solve the immediate problem. Morrison and his men would not forget this interference, and Broken Arrow would simply find another buyer for the next girl. But looking at her face, seeing the fragile hope that had rekindled in her eyes, Thomas knew he had no choice. "I'll pay double what Morrison offered. Gold, not trade goods." The effect was immediate. Morrison's face flushed with anger, while Broken Arrow's eyes lit up with greed. The girl's expression shifted from hope to confusion. She clearly did not understand why this strange white man would intervene on her behalf. "You don't know what you're doing, McKenna," Morrison snarled. "This is bigger than you understand." Thomas kept his rifle trained on the group while reaching into his jacket for the leather pouch that contained his life savings. The gold coins clinked together as he held it out for Broken Arrow to see. "Here's your payment. Take it and go." The Apache leader snatched the pouch and quickly counted the contents. Satisfied, he nodded to his warriors and began to turn his horse away. But before leaving, he spoke to the girl in rapid Apache, his tone harsh and final. Thomas did not need to understand the words to know that Broken Arrow was disowning her, cutting her off from her tribe and family forever. The girl's face crumbled as the reality of her situation hit her. She was now truly alone in the world, dependent on the mercy of a stranger. Morrison was less willing to give up his prize. "You're making a mistake, McKenna. That girl is worth more than you know. There are people in Mexico who would pay handsomely for her." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then I guess they'll have to find another source. You heard the man. She's mine now. Time for you to leave." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, with desert wind the only sound. Morrison's men were calculating their odds, but Thomas's reputation as a fighter was well earned. Finally, Morrison spat in the dust and wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, McKenna. You've made an enemy today." Thomas watched them ride away until they disappeared behind the mesas, then slowly lowered his rifle. Only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of what he had just done. He had spent his entire life savings to buy a girl he did not know, in a language he could not speak, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself. He turned to look at her, this Apache girl who was now his responsibility, and felt a mixture of fear and something else, something that might have been purpose. She was still bound, still sitting on the old mare, watching him with wary eyes. Thomas approached slowly, his hands visible and empty except for a knife he drew from his belt. She tensed as he reached for her bonds, but did not pull away. The rawhide cord was tight, cutting into her wrists, but Thomas worked carefully to free her without causing more pain. When her hands were free, she rubbed her wrists and looked at him with an expression he could not read. Thomas realized he had no idea what to do next. He had acted on instinct, but now he was faced with the practical reality of the situation. "Do you speak English?" he asked gently. She nodded slightly, then spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Little bit." Her accent was thick, but her words were clear enough. Thomas felt a small surge of relief. At least they would be able to communicate, even if only in basic terms. "My name is Thomas McKenna. This is my ranch. You are safe here." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Finally, she spoke again. "Why you help me?" It was a simple question, but Thomas found himself struggling to answer. Why had he risked his life and fortune for a complete stranger? Why had he thrown away years of careful planning and saving for someone whose name he did not even know? "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally, and realized as he spoke that it was the truest thing he had said in years. She nodded slowly, as if his answer satisfied some test she had been conducting. Then, with a grace that surprised him, she slid down from the horse and stood before him. "My name is Ayanna," she said, pronouncing it carefully so he would understand. "It means eternal blossom in my language." Thomas repeated the name, trying to match her pronunciation. "Ayanna, that's a beautiful name." For the first time since he had seen her, she almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of her lips, but it transformed her face completely. Thomas felt something stir in his chest that he had not experienced in years, the warmth of human connection. But the moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Thomas grabbed his rifle and moved to put himself between Ayanna and the approaching riders. His heart sank as he recognized Morrison and his men returning, probably with reinforcements. But as the riders came closer, Thomas realized his mistake. It was not Morrison at all, but a group of Apache warriors he did not recognize. They rode hard, their faces painted for war, and their intention was clear from the way they approached his ranch. Ayanna saw them too, and her face went pale. She spoke urgently to Thomas, her limited English strained by fear. "My father's brother. He comes for me. He angry about sale, about dishonor." Thomas felt his world tilt on its axis. The transaction with Broken Arrow had been legitimate according to Apache law, but apparently not everyone in the tribe agreed with the decision. Now he was facing the prospect of a war party seeking to reclaim what they considered stolen property. The warriors spread out as they approached, surrounding the ranch house in a classic Apache formation. Thomas counted at least 12 men, all armed with rifles and traditional weapons. He was outnumbered and outgunned, with no chance of fighting his way out. But as he looked at Ayanna, seeing the fear in her eyes, and the way she unconsciously moved closer to him for protection, Thomas felt something he had not experienced since the war, a purpose worth fighting for. "Stay behind me," he told her, then stepped forward to meet the approaching warriors. The leader was a man Thomas had never seen before, but his bearing and the deference shown by the other warriors marked him as someone of importance. He was older than Broken Arrow, with gray streaking his long hair and deep lines carved into his face by years of desert sun and hard living. When he spoke, his English was better than Ayanna's, but his tone was cold as winter wind. "White man, you have stolen daughter of my brother. You will return her, or you will die." Thomas kept his rifle ready but pointed at the ground. He had learned long ago that showing respect was often more effective than showing strength, especially when dealing with people who valued honor above all else. "I did not steal her. I purchased her from Broken Arrow, who said he had the right to sell her. I have the gold he demanded." The war leader's eyes flashed with anger. Broken Arrow had no right. Girl belongs to tribe, not to be sold like horse or cattle. You will return her now. Thomas felt Ayanna's hand touch his back, a small gesture of trust that strengthened his resolve. He had come too far to back down now, even if it meant facing impossible odds. "She is under my protection now. I will not let her be harmed." The Apache leader studied Thomas for a long moment, as if measuring his worth as a man. Finally he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "You are brave, white man, but foolish. You cannot fight all of us. Last chance. Give up girl and live." Thomas felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He thought of his lonely years on the ranch, of the empty house and the conversations with horses. He thought of the girl behind him, whose life hung in the balance of his next words. "Then I guess we have a problem," he said quietly. The war leader raised his hand, and Thomas knew that in seconds the desert would explode into violence. But before anyone could move, Ayanna stepped out from behind him and spoke in rapid Apache to the assembled warriors. Thomas could not understand her words, but he could hear the passion in her voice, the strength that had been hidden beneath her fear. She gestured toward him, then toward the warriors, her voice rising as she made what sounded like an impassioned plea. The war leader listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he replied in Apache, his tone less harsh than before. A heated discussion followed, with several of the warriors joining in while others remained silent. Finally, the leader held up his hand for silence. He looked at Thomas, then at Ayanna, and spoke in English. "Girl says you are honorable man. She says you risked your life to save her from slave traders. She asks to stay with you, to choose her own path." Thomas felt his heart stop. He had not expected this, had not imagined that Ayanna might actually want to remain with him rather than return to her people. The implications were staggering and dangerous. "She is free to choose," he said carefully. "I will not force her to stay or go." The war leader's eyes narrowed. "You understand what you say? Apache girl who stays with white man brings shame to family, to tribe. She becomes dead to us." Thomas looked at Ayanna, seeing the determination in her eyes mixed with pain at the thought of losing her people forever. He wanted to tell her to go, to return to her family, and forget about the strange rancher who had briefly entered her life. But the words would not come. "I understand," he said instead. The war leader nodded slowly. "Then it is decided. Girl makes her choice. But know this, white man, if she is harmed, if she is treated as slave or less than person, we will return. And next time, there will be no talking." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his warriors following. Thomas and Ayanna stood in the settling dust, both of them understanding that their lives had been forever changed by the events of this day. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Thomas turned to face the young woman who had chosen to stay with him. She looked small and vulnerable standing in the vast desert landscape, but there was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "You understand what you're giving up?" Ayanna nodded, her voice stronger now than it had been before. "I understand. I choose freedom over slavery. I choose hope over fear." Thomas felt something break open inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart years ago. This young woman had shown more courage in one day than he had managed in years of solitary existence. "Then welcome to McKenna Ranch," he said, extending his hand to her. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." She took his hand, and Thomas felt the warmth of human connection for the first time in longer than he could remember. As they walked toward the house together, he realized that his life of solitude was over. Whatever came next, he would no longer be alone. But as they reached the porch, Thomas caught sight of dust clouds on the horizon, riders approaching from the direction of town. His heart sank as he realized that their troubles were far from over. Morrison had not given up, and he was returning with reinforcements. The real test of Thomas McKenna's resolve was just beginning.